Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for attending this very special event in the Humanities Centre's fall programming. It really is a great pleasure to welcome Ibrahim Al-Marashi this evening. Educated at UCLA, Georgetown, and the University of Oxford, where he earned his doctorate, Dr. Al-Marashi is Associate Professor of History at California State University, San Marcos. Among his many publications are the co-authored books, Iraq's Armed Forces and Analytical History, The Modern History of Iraq, and A Concise History of the Middle East. He has also written extensively on the recent pandemic, with articles charting the historical connections between the COVID-19, Black Plague, Spanish flu, and smallpox pandemics. Dr. Al-Marashi has lectured widely throughout the world, while his work has appeared in such vital outlets as Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, and of course our own San Diego Union Tribune. His remarkable and well-known TED Talk, The Dodgy Dossier, The Iraq War, and Me, outlines the bizarre series of events that led to his research being unwittingly co-opted into the British government's case to go to war with Iraq in 2003. 20 years on from the commencement of that war, Dr. Al-Marashi visits us this evening to reflect further on these events in a lecture entitled History and Averting the Disasters of the Iraq War, Lessons from the Humanities, 2 decades later. So please join me in welcoming our very distinguished guest, Dr. Ibrahim Al-Marashi.
Thank you. It's an honor to be part of the speaker series. And just to highlight what an honor the speaker, to be invited for this speaker series is. This is to champion the tradition and future of the Artes Liberales. The Humanities Center has created the Illume speaker series, featuring our own renowned faculty scholars, invited thought leaders, and prominent public figures to advance the liberal arts on our campus and inspire lifelong learning in our surrounding communities. And for that reason, I'm happy to see to see members of our Iraqi community in San Diego, former alumni, faculty, and current students. So I'll begin this lecture with the famed Brazilian author, Paulo Coelho. In this article written for The Guardian, he is thanking President Bush for the wisdom of his leadership, which has united the world in opposition. Now, I realize a good number of you were probably born around the Iraq War, so I will, just to remind you that when I read this, Paulo Coelho is being sarcastic when he is thanking, at that time, former President Bush. Thank you for making it necessary for Tony Blair to go to the British Parliament with a fabricated dossier written by a student 10 years ago, and present this as damning evidence collected by the British Secret Service. Thank you for allowing Colin Powell to make a complete fool of himself by showing the UN Security Council photos, which 1 week later were publicly challenged by Hans Blix, the inspector responsible for disarming Iraq. So who was that student he was referring to? That is the Brazilian author. And in terms of, this is now deceased former Secretary of State Colin Powell. But to introduce you to what happened, I'm going to show you a video from February 2003, referring to Colin Powell's presentation in front of the United Nations.
The government's carefully coordinated propaganda offensive took an embarrassing hit tonight after Downing Street was accused of plagiarism. The target is an intelligence dossier released on Monday and heralded by none other than US Secretary of State Colin Powell at the United Nations yesterday. Channel 4 News has learned that the bulk of this 19-page document was copied from 3 different articles, one written by a graduate student. Our defense specialist, Julian Rush, has the details.
I will try to
On Monday, the day before the US Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the UN, Downing Street published its latest paper on Iraq. It gives the impression of being an up-to-the-minute, intelligence-based analysis, and Mr. Powell was fulsome in his praise.
Being hidden. I would call my colleagues' attention to the fine paper that the United Kingdom distributed yesterday, which describes in exquisite detail Iraqi deception activities.
Published on the Number 10 website and called Iraq, its infrastructure of concealment, deception and intimidation, it outlines the structure of Saddam's intelligence organizations. But it made familiar reading to a Cambridge academic.
Many of the words and phrases that it used I recalled from another context. So I searched around the other articles that I'd read on Iraq's organizations, its military and security organizations, and realized that large sections of the British government's dossier were actually copied
From here, an article last September in a small journal, the Middle East Review of International Affairs. Its author, Ibrahim Al-Marashi, a postgraduate student from Monterey in California.
The document, the British government dossier, is 19 pages long. Most of pages 6 to 16 are copied directly from that document.
Word for word.
Word for word. Even the grammatical errors and the typographical mistakes are copied.
Large sections do indeed appear verbatim. This, for example, 6 paragraphs long on Saddam's special security organization. The exact same words are in the Californian student's paper. Of military intelligence, Al-Marashi writes, the head of military intelligence generally did not have to be a relative of Saddam's immediate family nor a Tikriti. Saddam appointed Sabir Abdulaziz al-Duri as head. Note the comma after appointed. Downing Street paraphrases the first sentence, but the second is cut and pasted, complete with the same grammatical error. Academics take plagiarism seriously. It's intellectual theft. Downing Street didn't ask for permission to reproduce the work, which is not current, but actually an historical analysis of the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait before the last Gulf War.
He's writing his PhD thesis on the operation of Iraqi forces inside Kuwait, and his primary source of information is documents captured from the Iraqi government in 1991. The information, therefore, that he is using is 12 years old, and he acknowledges this in his article. The British government, when it transplants that information into its own dossier, does not make that acknowledgement. So it is presented as current information about Iraq's current security services, when really the information that it is using are some 12 years old.
Downing Street copied from 2 other articles from the magazine Jane's Intelligence Review. Its editor is happy to be quoted, less happy at the selective way some parts were edited.
What you need to look at is exactly how it's been compiled and collated. And the questions that you're asking about, has certain things been selected for spin, are right questions to be asked.
In several places, Downing Street edits the originals to make more sinister reading. Number 10 says the main intelligence agency is spying on foreign embassies in Iraq. The original read monitoring foreign embassies in Iraq. And the provocative role of supporting terrorist organizations in hostile regimes is weaker in the originals, aiding opposition groups in hostile regimes.
Part of the article.
And an original phrase describing a group made up of bullies and country bumpkins is in number 10's version, just bullies. Editing to make Saddam's apparatus look more terrifying, raising questions about the way number 10 is spinning the justification for war.
Julian Rush, well, I called Downing Street for reaction. No minister was available, and intriguingly, actually the Tory opposition didn't want to talk about it either. Downing Street offered this statement. Our report was put together by a range of government officials. The report makes this clear. The contents were drawn from a number of sources, including intelligence material. First paragraph only, I gather. The report does not identify or credit any sources, nor does it claim exclusivity on its contents. We consider the text as published accurate. The Downing Street spokesman would not be drawn on whether this included the typos and spelling mistakes.
Okay, so that's just a little blast from the past. Now, in terms of this lecture, when I'm talking about averting the disasters of the 2003 Iraq War, I'm not talking about grammatical disasters. I'm going to be talking about what did this plagiarism incident, how did it reveal a greater picture? What was the value of somebody who was doing his thesis, a historical thesis, a thesis based on history? What value was there for the British and then later US government? The fact that the plagiarism occurred, what other story can we deduce from how much both governments knew about Iraqi state and society on the eve of the invasion? And then ask a greater question. What is the role of history in international relations or in the formulation of policy? So First of all, this was the document that was the actual plagiarism. Now, not only did they copy my research, so if we look here, this was the actual plagiarized document that went all the way to the UN. Oh, there's some seats here if you would like to sit in the front. This was the document that was actually plagiarized. Now, not only offended me not only was my document, my research plagiarized, but the following, they even plagiarized my chart. Okay. Now, this was my chart. Okay, now this is just a poor copy, but let me tell you what is significant about this chart. It's not just the complexity of what we would call the security sector under Saddam Hussein, is that a schematic like this reveals but also obscures at the same time. Okay, what you can see here are kind of structural relationships between the various agencies that maintain the rule of Saddam Hussein, and also quite similar to if we look at the Iraqi security apparatus as of 2003, what is being obscured? I would argue on two levels, patrimonialism and primordialism. Each one of these charts represents a various security organization in Iraq, but it's also what it doesn't reveal. Okay. And what I was trying to highlight in my paper, what I mean by primordialism, let's just make sure the door is open. Excellent. Primordialism, basically, each one of these organizations more or less represented a tribe in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, okay? That's what we mean by primordialism. Now, tribalism in Iraq wasn't something that was inherent to Iraqi state and society during the rule of the Ba'ath Party. Tribalism was what we could more accurately describe as neo-tribalism. Reinventing tribes in the Iraqi imagination occurred after the 1991 Gulf War. It became a way of Saddam Hussein kind of keeping control over Iraqi society as the state was collapsing in the face of the war, as well as the sanctions. By patrimonialism, what does this chart indicate is the various numbers of people who were employed in these security services. These various security services were job creators for those neo-tribal groups that had maintained Saddam Hussein's rule. Okay. In other words, when I look at the chart, there is a question to be asked, and it's this: what happens if this system comes apart after 2003? Okay. In total, we're looking about 100,000 people who were employed by the Iraqi state who would have everything to lose. Were there no process of what's called disarmament and reintegration in a new Iraqi state and society? And so sure enough, what you saw here was the dissolution of the structure. Okay. The various people who had the motivation to form what was later would be called the Iraqi insurgency. The Iraqi insurgency took the US completely by surprise. But here what I'm going to argue is this is one of the cases where history could have been illuminating. The insurgency should have not been a surprise. Not only because here I basically argue here would be the manpower for a future insurgency, but this is where now history can offer some lessons from the past for the present. So what did the British government plagiarize? For those of you who are studying history, okay, basically this entire document that had ramifications for the 2003 war was based on what makes history, the collection of primary sources. These would have been some of the primary sources I would have looked at. Now, you have to realize this was unprecedented, the ability to look at documents from Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And the way that the document looks tells it all. These weren't documents given over by the Saddam Hussein government. These were documents that were captured. They were either captured by Iraqi Kurdish rebels in the north, or they were captured by US forces who had expelled the Iraqi military from Kuwait. These were the documents that were left over. So when you see the burnt marks here, yes, these were documents that were actually captured during warfare. And I want you to notice that staplers were almost non-existent in Iraq. Papers were kept together with a pen. And I can't tell you probably on how many occasions I probably got tetanus handling these documents. But it's good because these are documents that not only cause me physical harm, but mental harm as well. And you're going to see why. So in other words, when you're writing a history of Iraq, what is, or particularly the occupation of Kuwait from 1990 to 1991, what I like, with examining primary sources is look at this person's signature. It almost looks like the devil. And sure enough, he was quite satanic. So if I translate this was the head of the special forces in Iraq during the occupation of Kuwait. And just so you could see what kind of documents he would sign off on. Whenever Kuwaitis protested in the street, and just to give you a background of what was the point of my research was, little was known about what was happening inside of Kuwait from the time it was occupied. So what I basically wanted to do was to give a presentation of the occupation of Kuwait, okay, from the Kuwaiti perspective, yet revealed from Iraqi documents. So this person who I called kind of a satanic general, if the Kuwaitis were to gather in the street, this is what was supposed to be done. You need to walk to the demonstration area. He's giving directions to his military forces without vehicles and quietly get close to the demonstrators from behind and close their alternative routes of escape. Then open fire at the same time with everything you have, including rifles, automatic weapons, light cannons, and flamethrowers for the objective of killing all the demonstrators, so to serve as an example to all the others. And sure enough, these orders were carried out. So on one level, this is almost kind of, it's a human rights record of what was happening in Kuwait during its occupation. Now, of course, these were horrific, but imagine reading documents like this when the Iraqi military and security services ran out of paper. So what was happening? Because now remember, Iraq was under sanctions. So basically they would loot the various Kuwaiti stationery stores and basically find anything they could get their hands on and start using this. So this would be kind of a military document. Again, another thing. So they started to loot the Kuwaiti stationery stores. These are military records of 1991 with Goofy and Mickey Mouse. Now, why is this important? Just to show you again, kind of an examination of primary sources. How did this play out politically? Newfound Iraqi files raised heat on British member of parliament, and his name was George Galloway, otherwise known as Glorious George, okay? But what exonerated him? So I'll just give you kind of a background. Why was this member of parliament in the UK in trouble? Was because after the 2003 war, okay, documents were found that alleged he was on the payroll of Saddam Hussein's government. Okay. How was he eventually exonerated? It was because I had looked at so many of these documents. I was called in to look at the papers that implicated George Galloway, that basically said he was working as an agent on behalf of Saddam Hussein's government. And the minute I was handed the documents, I was able to tell them, this is a fake. I didn't have to read it. And what gave it away? So basically, we have to imagine what happened was there was I have to give it to him. He was entrepreneurial. There was an entrepreneurial Iraqi general who realized that there was a demand for documents implicating George Galloway. And so sure enough, he probably went to his old office, found some of the old paperwork, and created a fake document that said George Galloway was on the payroll of Saddam Hussein's government. What gave it away was this entrepreneurial general was probably seeking journalists, asking them for money to hand over these documents. And to make the documents look official and fancy, this Iraqi general used gold glitter to show that this came from the highest echelons of the Iraqi state. So what gave away that the minute I saw the gold glitter, how did I know these were fakes? Well, number one, remember what I was saying. There was a shortage of stationery at the end of the day. The operation and occupation of Kuwait was managed with children's notebooks. But at the same time, Look at this. Remember, that entrepreneurial general was a military officer. He wasn't thinking like a bureaucrat. What would gold glitter do to a document? Immediately, what do you do with a document? It gets issued in file. If we really had gold glitter, what would that do for the files? It would make a huge mess. So that's what gave it away to me. So in other words, what is the role of history? At least in terms of domestic British politics, being a historian and going through these primary sources did help. And you can see George Galloway and I kind of have the same dress, style of dress, if you will. On one level, this is him visiting my university when I was teaching in Spain. It did help exonerate one British member of parliament. But how else is history written? What was plagiarized? What was valuable in it was not only a reading of the documents of a bureaucracy. This is a thank you card. Okay. And to give you an idea of the kind of state and society in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, it's a thank you card that you would get. It's a postcard. It's what I call ephemera. And this is what was key of kind of capturing in Iraq after 2003. Imagine getting this postcard in the mail, thanking you for more or less essentially being a snitch. Okay. Thank you for turning something in. Turning someone in, okay? So if you ever heard the phrase, snitches get stitches, in Iraq, snitches get thank you cards in the mail from the equivalent of the FBI. Thank you for turning somebody in. And if you have further information, call our hotline where you could, I think there's some more people coming. Call our hotline if you have further information. Other paraphernalia includes even identity cards. This was one of the more notorious paramilitary groups known as the Fedayeen Saddam. And the best way to explain the Fedayeen Saddam is if you're following events and with the invasion of Ukraine, the equivalent of Wagner for Vladimir Putin, a group that kind of outsources violence, but at the same time, could turn against the dictator. This was controlled by Saddam Hussein's son. Okay? So even reading identity cards of those in the Fedayeen Saddam, to even children's books. Okay? This is how the history of the 1991 Gulf War was written. Okay? So on one level, this is what was plagiarized, the culmination of collecting the primary, all these primary sources informed my research into the history of the 1991 Gulf War. In other words, the collection of primary sources did have some policy ramifications, but I'll go to now the next stage. How could history illuminate the present? And I have to give a shout out to the person who designed this flyer because it worked out perfectly. Because I was going to show this image of the US forces deployed to Iraq. Okay? Because when this Humanities Center had a speaker series last year, we began with an examination of World War I. Okay. Given one of the speakers was Professor Catherine Statler. Now, when I give a lecture on World War I always kind of like to show this painting by John Nash called A Howitzer Firing and comparing it to this, because on one level, and I'll get to this, what does a painting like this or an image like this from Iraq reveal? A continuity, if you will. Notice the kind of the faces of the soldiers become merged. They become one with the machine. They become kind of cogs of this industrial warfare. So in other words, to go from that lecture, what did World War I have to offer in terms of lessons for the 2003 Iraq War? It's not so much World War I. I want you to look at two grandsons talking about World War I. So one of course, is myself writing for the Huffington Post. And the other grandson talking about his grandfather in World War I would be Simon Tolkien. Okay. And what are these grandsons talking about? How their grandfathers were transformed by the First World War. Of course, Simon Tolkien, you'll know his grandfather, J.R.R., okay? You probably haven't heard of my grandfather, okay? But what lessons does he have to offer? So I just wanted to show kind of a screenshot of my article, What's Happening in Iraq, and just show off, because for one day, my article was on top of Noam Chomsky's article. And that was just, these things, but, okay. These are the three most common myths about what's happening in Iraq. What was I using? In this case, I was using my grandfather's life, okay, to tell a lesson about Iraq, to understand the crisis with ISIS, okay? But on the eve of the 2003 Iraq War, I was also using my grandfather's life to tell a story about how would the occupation of Iraq turn out. Okay. In this case, I would say history is illuminated. In this case, the myth of the drawings of Iraq's borders is responsible for the current crisis. That was one myth that was going around. What was I using my grandfather's story to illuminate? Was the following, that there was a sense of Iraqiness before the First World War. Okay, and I'm going to be building up this argument because here is a meta-narrative that Iraq was an artificial creation created by the British from the domains of the three Ottoman provinces, thus putting together three antagonist communities that had nothing to unite them. And why do I use my grandfather's life to show that there was a sense of Iraqiness? Please come in. It's this, because in terms of another primary source that I find quite valuable, it's the following. It's my grandfather's passport. Okay. So in other words, now look what I'm arguing. I'm arguing my grandfather had a sense of Iraqiness. But what does the primary source tell you? It's the fact that he would have belonged to the Empire of Persia. Okay. So let me explain. Now let's go into the history of the passport. The passport started to become mandatory primarily after World War I for two reasons. Number one was a means to keep track of spies. And number two, remember, after World War I was a global pandemic. Okay. The Spanish influenza, or I shouldn't say the Spanish, let's just call it the 1918 to 1919 influenza pandemic. So you needed passports to keep track of spies and people who could be infected. So, in other words, why does my grandfather have an Iranian passport? Well, if he had to pick a passport, right? Where was he born, though? He was not born in what we would call Iran. He was born in Najaf, okay? And Najaf is a shrine city that does correspond to what is today's Iraq. So in other words, what my grandfather's passport shows is the following. Technically, my grandfather would be considered a Persian. Okay. Yet, what happened during World War I when the British invading on a road that the US would eventually use in 2003? He picked up a rifle to defend his land. In other words, even though he considered himself, if he had to choose a nationality, and what's fascinating about this is, by the way, he was born in Najaf. Where does he end up? Okay. So let's just keep on going through this primary source. I find fascinating in terms of just kind of on a divergence on this side is, of course, remember in the age of black and white photos, you have to have a description of one's height, one's hair color, and this doesn't translate well from Farsi, but what would this be? His skin color, okay? And the thing is, wheatish is a poor translation, but I find it illuminating at the same time. So my grandfather was wheatish in complexion. And why was this kind of illuminating back then? Is sometimes Persian and Arabic, the various hues we use to refer to colors of the skin, I find are a bit more nuanced than what we use in English, okay? Because of course, when we use colors such as white and black to describe somebody's appearance, white and black are essentially binary opposites, right? They're dichotomy. I found it interesting when some Persian bureaucrat was trying to translate this into English, that the word wheatish was invented. I found this kind of a bit wondering, if we use this system of bread, what would that mean for the way we imagine race? If my grandfather was wheatish, if somebody from France was the color of baguette, if somebody else was the color of pumpernickel, at the end of the day, we would all realize we're all pieces of bread at the same time. But no, unfortunately, we have the system there. So what happened? Yes, my grandfather picked up a rifle to fight the British in what they then called the Iraqi insurgency. So what was I saying on the eve of the invasion of Iraq? So not only was my research on the 1991 Gulf War plagiarized, because basically what they needed was to understand, how did Saddam Hussein operate in 1991? Surely that could help us understand how it works in 2003. But basically, I was saying this simple lesson. If my grandfather, okay, who in all intents and purposes you would consider Persian, okay, still felt a sense of Iraqiness that this is a land that I have to defend, okay, and imagine that. Then imagine somebody who considered himself 100% Iraqi. Surely, in this case, in 2003, if they saw foreign forces on their soil, most likely as they did back in 1920, surely they would rise up again. Now, keep in mind, the US Department of Defense made no provisions or planning for an Iraqi insurgency. The assumption was they would be welcomed as liberators. They would be welcomed with sweets and flowers, as one famous Iraqi exile said. And so this was that one illuminating case whenever I was on the lecture circuit. If my grandfather revolted in 1920 and fought the British, and what was in the words of the British in insurgency, surely one would happen again. Now we're going to get to the transnational nature of my lecture. This is also going to be labeled a lecture on Iraq and the world. Where did my grandfather eventually end up fleeing? He was arrested by the British. He eventually fled. And this is the story of the first member of the Iraqi diaspora. Now, I'm happy to see members of the Iraqi diaspora who came and attended. I would argue my grandfather was the first member of the Iraqi diaspora because when he left, there was no Iraq. The British were creating it, okay? And he fled. That's why he needed that passport. He fled to a place, now, okay, the British had arrested him. He was able to escape. So he was a wanted man. So where can you escape the British Empire? He fled to Zanzibar. Okay. Now, sure enough, by the time he arrived, okay, Zanzibar would be under British control by the time he arrived. There was a deal made where some islands off the northern coast of Germany were eventually exchanged. Fortunately, unlike the rebels in Star Wars, he got tired of fighting the empire and decided to settle down in Zanzibar. I have no primary sources of my dad's life in Zanzibar, but I do have primary sources of my dad's neighbor in Zanzibar. Yeah, this would be my dad's neighbor. This is where my dad would be born. So my dad's first language was Swahili. This is, again, my dad's neighbor, a bit older. Okay. And of course, my dad's neighbor, his name is Farah Bulsara. You know him as Freddie Mercury. Yes, that always surprises people. And somebody who grew up just a block down from my father's house. Yes, Farah Bulsara. Otherwise, it's Freddie Mercury, a name much more catchworthy. But think in Bohemian Rhapsody when the phrase Bismillah is uttered, or in the name of God. Okay, you have to realize that's his Zanzibari background. Okay, he, just like my father, would have heard this call to prayer. So, in other words, the insurgency. Now, I'm going to get to this because, again, let's now come to San Diego. Okay, 20 years after the invasion, okay, on May 1st. An aircraft carrier off the coast featured then George W. Bush declaring mission accomplished. Now, why was the mission not accomplished? Okay. In other words, something was happening. And it took a few months, but now let's bring the strands of my story together where history can illuminate. Okay. So what would happen just about 22 days later after the thumbs up were given off the coast of San Diego? Remember the chart I showed you? All of that was dissolved. So more or less, you took 100,000 men, okay, proficient in the use of arms and subterfuge, and more or less told them, you do not have a future in Iraq. Okay. Add that the other fateful decision of not only disbanding that security apparatus, but then going to the regular Iraqi military and telling them the same thing. Now, that was about 1 million men under arms, okay? I want you to imagine this, and this is where now kind of the act of empathy is going to be valuable. Imagine if you told all veterans in the San Diego area, think Oceanside, think Vista, that you served, but all those pensions you have waiting for you, all of that is also gone. Okay? Surely we too would have an insurgency in San Diego if they got that news, but that was the news in May 2003, that any Iraqi veteran would also lose not only their pensions, and those serving in the Iraqi army would also lose their career. Okay. Now, more or less, the first strand is this, that history can offer lessons. Now, it's a bit tricky what I'm going to say, and I have to offer some kind of nuance, okay? But here I'm not saying that history is repeating itself. It's something quite different, okay? And I want you to look at this. This is, rather than history repeating itself, this is what I call the securitization of history. So what do I mean by that? Okay. It's the following. By securitizing history, you're doing this. What is the role of history in international relations or in politics? It's the following. When you invoke history in the present, right, you're using the past to give yourself legitimacy in the present, right? So what did I say? I just gave you the circumstances of a group of Iraqis who now have no future in a post-Saddam Iraq, that they worked for the state, proficient in arms, right? So what do? They form an insurgent group. Okay, so even the name we use for this rebellion, just as there was an insurgency in 1920, and this was kind of the official British discourse, so too an insurgency breaks out again in Iraq's history. Now, here's what I mean by the securitization of history. The Iraqi insurgents can choose to call themselves anything they want. Fans of Saddam, New Saddam Order. This is what I mean by the securitization of history. No, what did they do? They go back and invoke the name of the 1920 rebellion. Because when you invoke history from the past, what does it do? It gives you legitimacy in the present. Okay, that's the first role of history. Okay. So in other words, just as my grandfather revolted, right? So here is the same thing. This is what I mean by the securitization of history. You're taking a date, 1920, and securitizing it. And when you securitize history in this case, then what does it do? And this is really the securitization of history is about temporality. You use the past to give yourself legitimacy in the present, but you also suggest inevitability in the future. Okay. So securitization of history can be kind of what, and here we come to the kind of confluence of the humanities and history and international relations, what's called the constructivist school of international relations. So all of you who want a good, an IR degree in a couple of minutes, here it goes. There's 3 schools I'm gonna focus on today. The realist school is this: nations are in a natural state of anarchy, and as a result, there is no global government. The world is, here's just a couple of C's: conflict and competition is the natural state of anarchy for nations, okay? There's another school, the liberal institutional school, says that despite this anarchy, cooperation can occur through the keyword international organizations, think the UN, EU. The constructivist school says basically conflict is a construct. Conflict is a construct. Okay? Conflict is what states make of the state of anarchy. Now, what I would argue is, the famous phrase is conflict or anarchy is what states make of it. Or in other words, conflict is what states make of it. It's also what non-state actors make of it. Okay, Al-Qaeda constructs a worldview. And here's a good one. What's part of the worldview? Al-Qaeda loves the events of 7/11, the conquest of Spain. Because again, it gives it inevitability. Just as Muslims conquered Spain in 7/11, so too we will make a foray into the heart of Europe in the present. Okay. So, in other words, what is this insurgent group calling itself? This is the securitization of history, right? The name they choose reveals, okay, the securitization of history. Okay. So, on one level, what did the past teach? Could have taught policymakers. Number one, if an insurgency happened in the past, surely it could happen again. And then number 2, on the other level, is that securitization of history. Okay? That history invokes tropes, symbols, metaphors, and narratives. Okay? At the same time, because this insurgency group wanted to create a narrative. And it's this. Just as the 1920 revolt created the Iraqi nation, the argument goes, okay, where you had the so-called tripartite division of Iraq, of Sunni, Shias, and Kurds coming together to fight off a foreign occupation, right? So too, this is the message, okay, that here is an attempt to overcome the sectarian divisions, to unite us in the face of an occupation. Okay, so mission wasn't accomplished. So now let me tell a greater transnational history. Okay, so just as I try to want to bring this lecture with Catherine Statler's lecture on World War I also want to bring this lecture with the last lecture series that Professor Mercado gave on the desert. Okay, because this is what I found fascinating, and here's the continuity was this. Basically, what you're saying here, please just ignore this guy. This is the picture I took, right? And really, I was just trying to ignore this guy to get focus on these guys here, because what are you seeing? If mission was accomplished, this is a picture I took in Iraq in 2004, right? Technically, US troops should be leaving Iraq, but what do we see in this picture? It's the other way around. Troops are being now deployed into Iraq, which is saying what? This is all to fight the insurgency. Okay, now what's fascinating here is if you look at these concrete barriers, you see, this is a border. If any Iraqi is to come close to this concrete barrier, they will be shot on sight. In other words, these roads in which the US troops are coming in, it's a new barrier within Iraq, you see. Anyone coming close to the security barrier, the concrete, would be killed. Now, at the same time, if you want to look at the greatest number of American fatalities, right? They weren't in pitched battles. Think Black Hawk Down. They weren't in battles like that. Most American fatalities were just simply this. They were sitting targets. And all it takes is just one improvised explosive when planted right here to go off. Most American fatalities you can see in a single picture here. Now, what I found fascinating was these two men's story, because when I'm talking about a border, I was really interested in their, to talk to them. And when I talked to them, and there's a reason I wanted to talk to them, they barely spoke English, which is telling me what? And where did they come from? El Paso, Texas. Okay. So in other words, what am I trying to do is read their story. In other words, they were like a good number of people crossing one border, okay? But what does joining the US military do? It fast tracks you to US citizenship, you see. And so here's the kind of meaning. I found it interesting that they, from crossing one border and overcoming the challenges of crossing that border, what have they done? Now they've created another border in the Iraqi desert. And that's their job. If any Iraqis were supposed to cross this road, they would shoot on sight. Now, that's the physical borders. Now we get the borders that are imaginary. How was Iraq imagined? Okay. By 2006, okay, it's no longer insurgency, but what you have is a civil war emerging in Iraq. It's fighting between Iraqis, Shias, and Sunnis. So that an op-ed was published in the New York Times, more or less arguing for soft partition. What is the solution for Iraq's problem during the civil war? Let's repeat the Bosnia model. Okay. Divide up Iraq's Shias, Sunnis, and Kurds into 3 statelets, just like it was done in Bosnia. Now you might say, okay, fine, it's just an op-ed in the New York Times. What's the big deal? Well, who's the author of the op-ed? It was Joseph Biden, you see, in 2006 when he was a senator, right? Now, when we talk about his model for soft partition, what is informing it? Well, his Irish background. Because when he was told Iraq conflict between the Shia, Sunnis, and Kurds was not inevitable, what was his retort? I've seen this in Ireland. I've seen this in Bosnia. And here's what I'm arguing. Does history play a role in international relations? Yes, but not all the time in terms of when you make faulty analogies like this. It was this Irish background that was saying, just as, you know, we, the Irish and the English couldn't get along, so surely we have to replicate this. So what begins are maps like this. How to solve problems in the Middle East. It's not just Iraq that should be divided, okay? Into these kind of ethno-sectarian divides, but then it would also solve problems in Syria as well. Let's divide Syria along a sectarian lines. Now, the problem, in other words, create a Shia Alawi state and a Sunni state. Now, the problem is this, and in this article, what I'm writing, do such things as Sunni stans exist? And why do they not? Why are they figments of our imagination? And the best way to show it to you is just showing you a simple picture. I am Sunni, I am Shia. Where's their child? Their child is a sushi. Okay. In other words, what does a single picture like this reveal? Okay, is the fact that there aren't clear demarcated, again, we're going to borders, whether it's Iraq, Syria, okay, or Lebanon is its neighbor, okay. There are plenty of sushi. May I call out a really cute sushi that was in this room but had to leave? Yes, if you want to look at that beautiful baby there, that baby would have been a sushi. It's my nephew. And it was very hard for me not to just go and like hug him right there. But yeah, so that was a beautiful sushi, for example. So in other words, again, what I'm using is kind of the personal to elucidate stories, but to kind of give you another act of empathy. For plans like this, if you want to understand, okay, drawing borders on the map, okay, was not only an exercise after World War I, it was an attempt to be repeated after 2003. But in an act of empathy, imagine if the same were to be done in the US. This is a sarcastic image created by the Lebanese satirist Carl Shadro. Okay, US pundits keep suggesting we redraw the map of the Middle East. I have a better idea, okay? But it would be analogous if the US were to be withdrawn, its borders were to be redrawn like this. Now, speaking of borders, and this is the constant theme, maybe it's best that I just erase them to get to the next part of the story. And again, I want to thank the members of the Iraqi diaspora who gave me this image. Sammy, thank you for this image. What would Mesopotamia have looked like without the borders, right? Now, I'm showing this to get to the next part of my story. It is because the minute I take away the borders from this, I get to kind of, hopefully, a way of teaching you a lesson that the argument that Iraq was a British creation and there was no sense of an Iraqi identity, the minute I take away the borders and I go back to antiquity, hopefully you're getting a message. It's just by the sheer geography, okay, that along these rivers, interaction is going to happen where identities are going to be formed, okay? And so here you get kind of a better picture, okay, of not only identities being formed as a result of these rivers, okay, but also another picture that this is land naturally people are going to settle in. Okay. So in other words, what does a map like this from antiquity reveal? The mosaic, and this is more of a better kind of, we're going to use metaphors and tropes, the mosaic. Okay. Now, when I show a map like this, now here comes the tragedy of the borders. In other words, on one level, I want you to look at the land from antiquity. And now we're going into the future. If we're looking at disasters, it's the following. Now the borders are being created. Okay. If there are lessons from the past that need to be acknowledged for the future, it's this, the lessons of political ecology. Okay. And political ecology, what do I mean by this? And I'll start to wind up, is that sometimes man-made management or human-made management of the environment could have disastrous consequences. Even with the borders, okay. Here I could tell you just an interesting story. I want you to look at Raqqa here. Okay. This was a map created when the Islamic State was on its rise. Raqqa is a good example of what James C. Scott, an academic at Yale, says. Sometimes the state's attempts to manage nature can have disastrous ramifications. And usually his famous example are dams. Okay. So when we get to the politics of dams, here's just one example. This dam here should have never been built. What's called the Mosul Dam. Okay, the geology wasn't good for a dam. Saddam wanted it there. If this were to collapse, which it could do at any moment, everything here will be flooded under about 5 meters of water. So not only was that a bad act of political ecology, then I want you to go to neighboring Syria. The waters around Raqqa were diverted because the Syrian state, prior to the events of 2011, attempted to be self-sufficient in the production of cotton. And cotton is a very water-intensive crop. Cotton production was tried in the former Soviet Union. It led to the almost desertification of the Aral Sea, and so too with the aquifers in Syria. So much so that so many farmers were displaced from the areas around Raqqa that they settled in the urban center of Raqqa. Now, talking about Syria is ironic because As I conclude, I was on this campus almost exactly 10 years ago, just in that theater over there, because the US was about to go to war against another country called Syria after a chemical weapon attack. So, in other words, does history offer lessons? Well, that was one of the lessons I was offering was this, okay? When you had so many displaced farmers, now you have a situation that's ripe for rebellion. I'm not saying the 2001 uprising in Syria was entirely determined by political ecology, but it was one of the factors. Now, what I found fascinating is, if you look at a good number of displaced farmers in Raqqa, who came around and started to offer them salaries? It was the Islamic State. So here we have a story of displaced farmers joining the Islamic State. Now, I want you to go down to the marshes here, where this body of water was destroyed in an act of punitive political ecology. This wasn't mismanaged water resources. This is water deliberately diverted after the Gulf War, so Saddam Hussein could contain a rebellion there. The waters were restored, but never to their pre-Saddam levels or before Saddam diverted the waters. Okay. Which means what? Salinization coming from the Gulf is happening to such a level that the marshes, despite their restoration, okay, have witnessed as well not only displaced farmers coming as a result of salinization, but the constructions of dams upstream in Turkey has reduced the flow of water going downstream, which is again another story of displaced farmers. Now, when ISIS invaded Iraq in 2014, and a good number of them, I would argue, would have been farmers displaced from Raqqa, Shia militias emerged in the south, and who did they recruit from? Displaced farmers from the marshes. And what I found fascinating was this a scenario where displaced farmers from the marshes could have been fighting displaced marshes from Raqqa. Does history offer lessons? Okay, this might be a good example of a harbinger of displacement. It might not be obvious, okay, but as we proceed in the future, okay, the ramifications of political ecology leading to conflict. Now, to conclude, this is an article I wrote, okay, about in 2017 for the Union Tribune, okay. Now I want to bring us to the local San Diego County. Where we live is one of the largest concentration of Iraqis outside of the US and one of the largest concentrations of Iraqi Christians. What is, to my dismay, is that I've never been able to teach the history of Iraq to Iraqis, okay? But particularly for a university like this that actually has an exchange or a connection to Catholic University of Erbil, okay? That the practice of Middle Eastern Christianity is rarely taught at the university levels, even where you have Middle Eastern Catholics, right? Even at a Catholic university like this, the subject isn't taught. Now, why is this such an important transnational subject? I wanted to show you a lesson also now going back to Iraq. This is a picture I took, and if you probably don't know this, let me zoom in. That's a crescent. That's a crescent. Now, do you notice? Even with the Virgin of Guadalupe, the Virgin is always standing on an image of a crescent. This is a picture I took in a village in Lebanon, in Bishwat, Our Lady of Bishwat. And again, you notice the crescent, right? Now, you probably don't realize this, but what is the symbol of Islam? It's the star and crescent. And what is the connection? This isn't an accident. This isn't a coincidence, okay? When the Ottomans conquered Constantinople, what was the flag of Constantinople? It was the star and crescent. Because in old Byzantium, the star was a stand-in for the Virgin Mary. So just as the Ottomans, it's just basically co-opted the symbol of the conquered, right? It eventually became associated with Islam, but for the longest time, people didn't realize that the symbol of the star and crescent is actually a Christian symbol. So that's still used to this very day. Still used in our campus. Now, the crescent, why was it always depicted with the Virgin Mary? There has to be a history to that too. And that again offers, we could say Mesopotamia offers a lesson here. The crescent was a symbol of fertility, associated with the Babylonian moon god Sin, S-I-N. So here what I found fascinating is to even understand the symbol on our campus here, the practice of faith from Babylonian times, the confluence of Islamic symbols, two symbols that are now even sacred for, Mexican identity comes together. And then now when we look at the future, and what I'm trying to give you is kind of the diversity that comes out of Iraq, climate change will not only lead to what we could call the securitization of Iraqi society or the militarization. Okay. Iraq is also the site of I find one of the most fascinating faiths, okay, that it should be considered kind of a living UNESCO heritage. A faith that incorporates elements of Gnosticism, reversion for John the Baptist, okay. The Mandaean community is another community where baptism is so sacred to their faith, okay. But imagine when these rivers dry, what will Iraq lose? Here's the confluence of not only climate change, but the collapse of security. It's that members of these communities not only have been persecuted in Iraq, but also have been forced to flee. A good number settling to San Diego. Do you mind if I call you out too as well? And also joining us in our lecture today as well. So thank you for coming. And then finally, when I'm looking at kind of the diversity in Iraq, we also forget that Iraq had a slave trade. And look at this article, what I talk about. The Afro-Iraqis, from medieval slave revolts to climate apartheid. You've all probably heard of the Spartacus slave rebellion. But this was another slave rebellion that was part of Iraq's history, and telling stories of different Iraqi histories. This isn't so much of the securitization of history, of using history to create an identity. Iraq's African community is influenced by movements such as Black Lives Matter, okay, was inspired by the election of Barack Obama. Okay. And just as Martin Luther King was killed and was a hero for one of its organizers, so too the leader of Iraq's Afro-Iraqi community was assassinated as well. And sure enough, too, when we talk about climate apartheid, this is the most marginalized Iraqi community. Last summer, Iraq witnessed temperatures, both Iraq and Kuwait, and again, in this case, borders don't mean much when it comes to the sun, witnessed some of the hottest temperatures in recorded history, up to 150 degrees. Okay. Without an air conditioner, life is unbearable. Now, what does Iraq lack to this very day, 20 years later? Reliable electricity. What do a good number of Afro-Iraqis lack? Air conditioning. And then finally, I wanted to talk about a gendered aspect. Iraqi women still live legacy of gender-based violence. I promise this isn't just an advertisement for all my lectures. What else did Iraq witness on its soil? Something I would argue was almost an act of gendercide. And that was the enslavement of another Iraqi minority, the Yazidi community. And when their women in particular were enslaved because they were considered a sect that worshiped the devil, I would argue in itself that was almost an act of gendercide. I want to leave some time for questions. So I'll just promise to bring it now back to San Diego. When I talk about victims of war, now you're noticing the same. What did I say? Averting the disasters of war. Each and every one of these slides I've talked about are people, individuals who deal with micro disasters on a daily basis, whether it's Iraq's dwindling Mandaean community, Iraq's Afro-Iraqi community, but I would also want to bring it back to the local. Okay. What I find fascinating about the veterans who came back, okay, is the following. Because go back to that slide I showed you of trying to create a border within Iraq. Most of the people who have PTSD in Iraq, okay, were the victims of these improvised explosive devices, including a good number of my students at Cal State San Marcos, okay, who lost people due to not the actual invasion of Iraq, but the insurgency that wasn't anticipated. That's where most of the veterans, or those who were the fatalities, the American fatalities. But what I also find fascinating, and yes, I do have a lot of tabs open when I took these screenshots, is the following. The algorithm. Iraq, what do veterans now try to do? Whether they go to opera, to deal with their trauma, or engage in the violence to deal with their trauma. I found this such an unfortunate ad. You have these guys who were sent, soldiers who were sent abroad, then you had an ad for the expendables. But what I find fascinating is, this was the article, Fight Club reawakens and channels veterans' warrior spirit. But you see what the algorithm is saying? Here we have a natural PTSD remedy for you. And the algorithm is trying to capitalize on this. Thank you for your service. So on and so forth. Okay. And again, in terms of just telling kind of a story of the victims of war, which I think would be worthy of another class. Okay. Dogs with PTSD. I didn't realize. And this, okay, these ads, yeah, I was looking for tea when I did this screenshot. But on the other side, sometimes if I could tell a positive story, I would have never imagined this. In the Middle East, dogs are really treated poorly. I would have never imagined the phenomena of cananophiles in Iraq. But again, one of the unanticipated products of the insecurity in Iraq, what did the Iraqis all of a sudden realize? We have no electricity, we're often robbed. What is the best alarm system? It is to adopt dogs. And so sure enough, they got imported from Turkey. So, to conclude, are there lessons from history? So on two levels, the final two lessons are lessons from history and humility. I'm going to cite John McNeill, who is a great environmental historian, but this is a conclusion he wrote on the eve of the debates of whether the US was going to bomb Syria. Because the historical trope that was being invoked back then was Munich. The US doesn't act, it will be an act of appeasement, just like Hitler on the eve of the Munich Agreement. Okay. So what was John McNeill, the great environmental historian, basically saying about this? Are there lessons from history? In a direct and narrow sense, I would say not. To twist, you can't face the same foreign policy quandary twice. Neither Munich nor Vietnam. And Professor Statler and I, we gave a joint presentation when Kabul fell in 2021, because often the analogy of Saigon was referring to the events of 1975. Neither Munich nor Vietnam tells us what to do about Syria or Iran or North Korea. The Great Depression tells us nothing directly about what policies to pursue in the current economic doldrums. There are no lessons of history that can be acquired in one sitting. Historical analogies, when used in the policy arena, are facile and untrustworthy. Using them is misusing history, and probably at least as bad a procedure as navigating the shoals of policymaking and complete ignorance of all history. So is there anything left? Yes, I would argue there is. A general knowledge of history acquaints you with the possible range of possible outcomes from any initiative. It helps you to assess probabilities and to respect the unexpected. It deepens your humility in the face of the law of unintended consequences. It shows you the limits of intentionality in human affairs. And so basically with this whole presentation, I've been channeling McNeill. What did I say? It acquaints you with a possible range of outcomes. Would an invasion possibly unleash an insurgency? Possibly, based on my grandfather's experience, what I used to say. The probability of the unexpected. The humility in the face of unintended consequences. You disband the security services of Saddam Hussein. Not only do you create a second insurgency, at the end of the day, what happened? This was supposed to be a war against terror. You create a branch of Al-Qaeda that's even deadlier than Al-Qaeda, ISIS. You embolden a country that you were supposed to be containing in this war on terror, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Talk about unintended consequences. And finally, other lessons. Yes, there are some lessons about how to use commas properly. It's quite embarrassing that my poor use of commas gained international fame, but I was wondering how many people would eventually know about this. Well, sure enough, a writer named Lynn Truss decided to end her book with my use of poor commas. And here's the funny thing. If all these high moral arguments have had no effect, just remember that ignorance of punctuations, not only ignorance of history. This is a lecture on not only the securitization of history, the securitization of commas. In February 2003, a Cambridge politics lecturer named Glenn Rungwala received a copy of the British government's most recent dossier on Iraq. He quickly recognized in it the wholesale copying of a 12-year-old thesis by American doctoral student Ibrahim Al-Marashi, reproduced word for word, misplaced comma for misplaced comma. And I was thinking again, how many people will read a book about the poor use of commas? Apparently 3 million. Apparently 3 million. If they've gotten to the end of the book, they know about my poor use of commas. So to conclude, there was a film made about my life. I'll get to it. So we ignore the rules of punctuation at our political peril, as well as our moral detriment. When Sir Roger Casement was hanged on a comma all those years ago, who would have thought a British government would be rumbled on a comma, and a Yob's comma at that, 9 years further down the line? Doesn't it feel good to know this, though? It does. It really does. So the whole plagiarism here, the person from The Sopranos, they made him into Colin Powell, I think, as a way to avoid paying royalties. And who played me? You might say, Ryan Gosling, Leonardo DiCaprio? No, they turned me into a woman. Do you know who this is? This is Ann Chomsky from Inventing Anna, the Netflix series. Yeah, she played me. Using personal stories to tell lessons of history. I love it. So, having said that, and you have to keep in mind, this was one of the files to manage the occupation of Kuwait. Both Sinbad and I thank you for coming. Here's my emails, and I appreciate for spending the time. And sorry, we have time for questions. So if you have questions, please do ask it. But again, I just want to thank you for coming out here tonight. Now, while we do that, and again, I'm shameless. If you want to hear the story of the Star and Crescent, this is an article I just published not too long ago, From Ukraine to Lebanon, A Tale of Two Marias. I highly recommend you read this story connecting what was I doing on the first day of the invasion of Ukraine and the story of interfaith family. Yes, you had a question, please.
Yeah, I know that some people, first of all, thank you for your comment.
Thank you. And are you an undergraduate student?
Yes.
And where do you come from?
Kuwait.
Kuwait. So I wrote about something you're too young to remember. And hopefully when I publish this book, it will be the first proper history of what happened in those months. But please.
I have a question. I know you were referred to as the man who started.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, and so I just want to know from your perspective, how did that feel as first like a student, so a doctoral student, and how do you feel in both your social life and your future academic career, especially post 9/11 in the US?
So I never got to tell you the best part of this story. So imagine a year goes by, and here you saw the news of the events. Okay, and here we get the role of the mass media. Okay, you have to imagine when I moved to Istanbul, Turkey, I was sitting at Starbucks anyway. Okay, I'm not sure if there's copyright or anyway, I was sitting at Starbucks and I saw somebody on the front page of the Turkish newspaper, Sabah. Zainab. So Sabah, which is also the name of a Turkish newspaper and my mom's name, who's somewhere around. But anyway, the person in front of the Turkish newspaper looked familiar. I looked closer. The headline said in Turkish, the man who finished off Saddam Hussein has just moved to Istanbul. The man who started the war is now teaching at one of our universities. It was a picture of me. Do you see how it doesn't take much, but what would sell better in terms of newspaper? Somebody who was plagiarized, okay, or somebody who was a grand architect who wanted to finish off Saddam. Okay, so he wrote this document so that it would intentionally get plagiarized. In other words, it's great, my foresight, hoping it would get plagiarized so that it would convince. And remember, this document went to the British Parliament. The British Parliament voted to go to war against Iraq the minute that document was introduced. It goes again to, it just sold better that I would be the architect of the Iraq war. Now, this is the thing about international media, it's this. I'm sorry, both international and local media. When I went to give an interview on CNN Turk, the Turkish equivalent of CNN, to kind of basically clarify that. So sure enough, I'm talking, saying this is what really happened, right? It was really a document plagiarized by the British. By no means was I an architect of the war, but what was the banner underneath saying? The man, the architect of the Iraq War, is joining us with Mehmet Ali Birant. So I'm talking to Mehmet Ali Birant, who's basically like an Anderson Cooper of Turkey. And I'm trying to explain everything, but the banner underneath is saying the man who started the war has just moved to Turkey. Academically, it caused me a lot of problems. You would have to imagine on a campus like this, where I was teaching, I might have a group of students protesting against me just outside, saying we don't want the architect of the Iraq War on our campus. But in terms, it was really a story that more or less was contained in Turkey. But sure enough, give it 20 years later, and a lot of the former, let's say, kids of the Ba'athis or Saddam loyalists would also reconstrue the story like that. So that sure enough, on the 20-year anniversary of the Iraq War, yeah, sure enough, this trope came up again. That this was something intentional on my part, whereas it was an accident. Because if I really wanted to start the war, at least I would have checked for comma mistakes. You know, this was a very rushed document, as you can see. If I was really a grand architect of the war, I would have checked for comma. There was no Turnitin back then, by the way, for the British government, and no chat GPT that could for them that I could have written this document. But so yes, thank you for coming in. That's a really good question. Yes. I mean, if you looked on the eve of the invasion of Kuwait, remember the US had tilted towards Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, that even on the invasion of Kuwait, you had elements of that, of the Bush administration, the George H. Bush administration, in Congress lobbying on Iraq's behalf. I mean, so there you go. I mean, the tilt from the US towards Iraq to contain Iran definitely existed. So how do you go from a country that was, you know, almost not a ally, but a de facto ally, to becoming a country that gets invaded? It took an international crisis like the invasion of Kuwait. Okay, and I think even to some extent, Saddam Hussein was surprised by the American reaction. But then to say, was it a continuation of the 2003 Iraq War? It took 1990 to 1991 for the enmity between the US and Iraq to begin. But I wouldn't say it was a predetermined outcome. I would say, first of all, 9/11 had to have happened. Okay. And then second, no, still, I wouldn't say it's a predetermined outcome, because this was very much the actions of the administration of the time. And then we get into the big debate. It wasn't a predetermined outcome that the US would invade Iraq. This was very much the decision of a couple of determined men in the administration that I think saw a window of opportunity, you see. So when I say a window of opportunity, I don't think that's a predetermined outcome. But definitely, yes. I mean, the Gulf War made Iraq an enemy of the US in the post-Cold War order. And in a post-Cold War order, where there's no longer kind of bipolar, you know, this bipolar relationship in international relations, I think the US was trying to remake an international order. Remember, the war against Iraq was launched via the UN. And I think this was the image of the new system that the US wanted to establish, is that, sure, we are now the dominant superpower in a unipolar moment, but we're still going to go through the motions of working through the international institutions like the UN, and hence the term, that new world order. Right? That set things in motion, bringing us to the plagiarism. I think when Colin Powell was in front of the UN, this was America's last attempt to try to do what it did in 1991. But at the end of the day, the 2003 Iraq War was very much a unilateral invasion of the US by Iraq. So that's why I say that it's not necessarily a predetermined outcome. History didn't necessarily dictate it. All it did was make Iraq an enemy. But at the end of the day, it was the active choice of a group of people after 9/11 in the US who said, let's invade Iraq without anticipating the consequences that history could have illuminated. Antoinette.
encounter of spinning. I mean, the war was spinning also on the media, which was the firm of the New York Times published this piece. Did it remember?
Yes.
I remember in 2002, we're going to war. There is no whether it's justified or not. They already decided, right? So how can you manage yourself that identity has been that is skinny identity as a historian? And you go back to history and you are explaining to us how it happened, how it unfolded. But in the media world, is that still makes sense? You're still
No, it's quite interesting. So I'll go back, and when you mention kind of Judith Miller and the zeitgeist at that time, it's quite interesting that the plagiarism wasn't much of a story in the US. It was just an inconvenience at a narrative that was almost kind of predetermined. In the UK, it was huge. It was hugely embarrassing for Tony Blair, but also there was kind of a groundswell of opposition at that time. So it says a lot. So whereas in the UK, this was wonderful. This was a huge embarrassment for Tony Blair. In the US, something that would have been embarrassing for Colin Powell back then was really hushed up. And it's amazing when almost 2 years ago, in October 2021, when he passed, this is what he was remembered for in all the obituaries. So you have in 2003 kind of the attempt to shield Colin Powell and any kind of critique of the war. So it says a lot, is that the kind of the current narrative of the time dictated, whether I made a big splash or barely a footnote. So then we jump to 20 years. But I mean, this was also the first indication. And so again, then what do I do with all of this? This was one of the first indications that there was something wrong with the intelligence leading to the Iraq War. And that's always what I could use in my personal case. So what do I do is I just use my personal story, particularly around March 2023, when the debates were very vitriolic, remembering this. It's just a reminder, there were indications that there was something wrong with this intelligence leading to the war. And it says a lot. So again, when we're talking about kind of the role of the international, the media as the fourth estate and their watchdog role, you see, in that case, I would say there was a failure on the US side, but not on the British side, where the US side failed to kind of start asking the question, kind of more or less adopting Judith Miller's narrative. Whereas on the British side, that question was asked. If this is what the British government is doing, think of the tone of, Snow's interview. And the other interesting thing was that the UK did have an inquiry into the intelligence. Altogether, I think the inquiries in the UK lasted about 16 years. That's how long it took for me to find out who actually plagiarized me, where there was never any kind of similar process in the US. So I think that's also a major difference. And I think that's why the debates here were a lot more vitriolic. Whereas in the UK, they said, we did it. We interrogated the person who kind of led us into the war, has been called to account. I mean, the demand for apology from Tony Blair was something that was done in the UK, but not so much here. And I think that was one of the failings of the US media around 2003.
One more question?
Yes.
Yes, please. So I wanted to ask, how did you, as the current student, manage to set the capture and the documents from Kuwait? How did you...
Very good question. Yeah, how do you get access to them? This required some kind of entrepreneurialism. It's this. They were originally digitized. The US had just declassified them. So when the US declassifies its intelligence documents, you have to wait 30 years. When it's a foreign government's intelligence document, it doesn't matter. They just release, they dump it to the public. Now, keep in mind, a lot of these documents had also been vetted if there was anything from the Iraqi state that might have embarrassed the US, I don't think those would have been released. So what you do is have the vetting. And it was just very simple. Harvard University was basically the home of those captured Iraqi documents. So it was more or less approaching the people at Harvard, asking them, can I work on these documents? And just being, in that case, at the right place at the right time, because it allowed me to be the first person to write a thesis on documents from Saddam Hussein's Iraq that hadn't been done. But it was, again, it's kind of like a Forrest Gump story. You know, where Forrest Gump is always in the kind of unusual place at an unusual time. So it was getting access to those documents at Harvard. The Kuwait documents, I had a short window that had just been released. There were enough that I could write a thesis. And then writing that thesis on 1991, right before 2003. It's a confluence, basically, to answer your question. Serendipity, if you can say that now in reflection. All right, thank you. May, thank you for, yes. No, thank you for coming. Okay, that's a really good question. And that's basically coming back to when I was on this campus 10 years ago. So in other words, all the intelligence that might have led the US into a war against Syria, I was using this example, saying now learn from history. Okay, learn from history. If faulty intelligence led us into one war, okay, let's not rush into another war without looking at all the circumstances and all the intelligence. Let's hope in another 10 years, there is no war for me to talk about. It just off of the 10-year cycles or 20-year cycle. But that's the ultimate, I think, lesson. And to understand the war in Ukraine, of course, again, we're getting now to the lesson of history. Can Saddam Hussein offer us lessons to understand Vladimir Putin? I do see similarities, especially in response to the Wagner events. I think, so here is just one historical lesson we might conclude on. Saddam Hussein never recovered when his son-in-law, his trusted son-in-law, defected in 1995, 96, 97. Never recovered from that. He was never the same person. It was the greatest threat to his security. And what did Saddam say to his son-in-law? Come back to Baghdad. I'm not going to harm you. You'll be fine. And sure enough, a few nights after his son-in-law came back to Baghdad, he was killed in a shootout at his house. Saddam basically killed his son-in-law and sent a message. Very similar to how Putin took care of Prigozhin, right? Sending a message. But now this is my question. Has Putin been shook to the core? And will he ever recover from this betrayal? That's just one interesting historical analogy, but that's it at the end of the day. So I think you can look at these kind of interesting similarities in terms of understanding the desperation of despots, if you will. And I think that's an interesting, and that's it. It's just interesting thought experiments, food for thought, but there's only so far you could go with that. You have to be, again, as we conclude, humility in the face of history at the end of the day. Thank you.